Before starting his lecture, I want to introduce Dr. Derek Sherman. Actually, the pronunciation is Sherman. Sherman. Yes, some people would say Sherman. Derek Sherman has worked as an electrical engineer and then later completed his PhD at McMaster University in the area of robotics and machine learning. He is the holder of several patents and have taught at Redeemer University in Ontario, Doughty University in Iowa, and he is currently a professor of computer science at Calvin University. Dr. Sherman is a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation. That's right. Yeah, still right. Thank you. A member of the Association of Christians in the Mathematical Sciences and an advisor for AI and faith. He is also an established voice in conversations about faith and technology, for which is today's topic. And he is an author of a book, Shaping a Digital World. That is the book which I read a long time ago. And he recently published the book, kind of Faith and Technology. The title is Field to Guide to Christian. I'm sorry, I forgot the title. And today's lecture's title is, as you see, the story of progress and a path to responsible technology. And he will introduce this lecture related to Bible narratives of creation, fall and redemption and restoration. I hope. This is my brief introduction of Professor Derek Sherman, and please join me in welcoming Derek Sherman.
All right, thank you for that kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in South Korea, and so I'm delighted to be able to learn more about Korean culture and to visit some different universities and also to visit with you today. So I'm grateful for the invitation. So I'm going to start with an assignment for you to talk to your neighbor about this painting and tell me what you see. So talk to your neighbor, talk to someone nearby, and discuss this painting and discuss what you see in this painting. And then we will have a few of you share some of your thoughts. So take a minute or two to do that now. Thank you.
Okay.
So hopefully you can see that a little better. So just take another minute and discuss with the person next to you, what do you see in this painting? What does it make you think about? Let's see if some of you are willing to share what you see in this painting. Is there anyone, just things that you see, things that you notice in this in this painting? Anyone? Yeah.
There's a lot that shows about like march of progress, like in terms of technology, as you can see, like the telephone lines coming alongside the trains.
Yes.
A lot about manifest destiny and taking over natural boundaries, I guess.
Very good. Yes. So the you see the telephone line being strung, the March of Progress, what sometimes is referred to in America as manifest destiny. Yes. Any other observations? Someone else? Some things you noticed about this painting? Well, if you look, you'll see. You'll see that it's going from lightness to dark, right? So there's this figure here. It looks a little bit like an angel. It's a herald of progress, and it's moving from sort of the right side, sort of westward, right? Kind of moving west. And she's holding a book, which represents knowledge. She's stringing the telephone wires, which represents communications and technology. We see boats and trains. And if you can see, over here you see, indigenous peoples who are being scattered by the oncoming technology and progress, which is not really politically correct anymore. It's kind of a very optimistic view that technology brings light, technology brings a better culture, but this was the view of progress in the 19th century, and I would say that this kind of view persists today. So I too grew up with technology. Now I'm a little bit older than most of you, I think, and I was a teenager in the 1980s, and my very first computer was a Timex Sinclair ZX81. It had 1 kilobyte of memory. Maybe some of you remember that. And you hooked it up to your television, so there's no monitor, but you used your television, and you loaded and saved programs to an audio cassette. And I was completely mesmerized by this machine. It captured my imagination. I thought, oh my goodness, what is the computer going to do to the world? It was magical. And I went on from that time in order to study engineering and then work in technology and computing. But I was amazed at the progress of personal computers at the time. And of course, that computer was running on a Zilog Z80 CPU, which had about 8,000 transistors. And if you look at Moore's law, which isn't really a law, it's more of an observation, which says that basically the number of transistors on a silicon chip approximately doubles every 18 months or so. So this y-axis is logarithmic. And what we're seeing is the march of progress in transistor counts on a CPU until we get to the modern era, where we've got 50 billion transistors or so, on the order of tens of billions of transistors. It's unbelievable. And of course, I don't have to explain this to any of you because you are all LLM experts, but the emergence of ChatGPT and large language models has brought about even more staggering kind of changes. And I thought, just to kind of demonstrate, I mean, you all know about LLMs, but I went into ChatGPT and I said, write a short poem in Korean comparing artificial intelligence and kimchi. And I can't read Korean, so I will have to leave it up to you to tell me whether this makes any sense. But I've been told by Korean friends that this actually does make sense. And what's amazing is that we now have such capabilities in terms of data collection. We have huge data sets that we've been able to collect from the internet and the web and from other sources. These data sets include Korean, they include poetry, they include information about kimchi, they include information about artificial intelligence, and these machines are able to kind of consolidate these things and reply and sort of from prompts in ways that are plausible and remarkable. And so we see progress also in the area of artificial intelligence, of course. And some people have said that progress really is equivalent to technological progress, that technological progress is really what progress is all about. And in fact, if you look at how we sort of give a name to the era in which different civilizations lived, it's often named after the primary technology of the time: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Steam Age, the Electrical Age, and of course we're living now in the communications and digital age and age of AI. And the notion of progress is that there is a pattern of change in history that consists of irreversible changes in one direction only, and that direction is always towards improvement. And so progress is this idea that you're always moving forward, and it's always better and better, is the idea of progress. This is an image from the 1933 Chicago's World Fair. And what you see is a robot, and the robot is kind of pushing the human into the future. It isn't humankind that's leading the future, it's technology that's leading the future. It's this idea that, that technology is actually leading us into the future. It isn't us. And it's inevitable, and we can't change it. And this is not a new story in some ways. The Enlightenment story goes back hundreds of years to the beginnings of science and technology. And the Enlightenment story is a story that basically says that through the pursuit of reason, the scientific method, humans will progress to create better and better societies and better people. That is the story of the Enlightenment. And basically, if you look at it, it's a bit of a rival story to the traditional biblical story that was sort of the main story prior to the Enlightenment. The biblical story sees a future of a new heaven and a new earth. And what happened was that in the Enlightenment, they replaced that story with one of human accomplishment, in which humans can redeem themselves and usher in their own version of heaven, or utopia, one that was without God. In this city, the heavenly city of the Enlightenment philosophers, the writer writes that the philosophers in the early sort of Enlightenment period demolished the heavenly city of St. Augustine, only to rebuild it with more up-to-date materials. It was technology that became the royal road to utopia. And we see this repeated again and again throughout history, in the history of technology. Here's a quote from Tesla that he wrote as he was developing electricity. Tesla wrote, "We have soon to have everywhere smoke annihilators, dust absorbers, ozonizers, sterilizers of water, air, food, and clothing, accident preventers on streets, elevated roads, and in subways. It will become next to impossible to contract disease germs." Now that would have been good during COVID, but anyways, disease germs or get hurt in the city. Humanity will be united, wars will be made impossible, and peace will reign supreme. Those are big claims for electricity. Now, don't get me wrong, electricity is wonderful and it opens up all kinds of possibilities, but I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that it will end warfare and that it will unite humanity. The same sort of claims were made with the telegraph. When the telegraph was strung between North America and Europe, writers were making all kinds of claims, including some of these quotes. "It will be impossible that old prejudices and hostilities should longer exist while such an instrument has been created for the exchange of thought between all. People predicted that the telegraph would bring world peace and that they'd have to turn their muskets into candlesticks." This was the claims that were being made. And we see this repeated again and again as new technologies emerge. Nicholas Negroponte is a well-known professor in the MIT Media Lab, and at the sort of dawn of the World Wide Web, he wrote that a new generation is emerging from the digital landscape, free of many old prejudices. Digital technology will be a natural force drawing people into greater world harmony. Now, if you've gone on the World Wide Web, you probably noticed that world harmony is not one of the things that sort of resulted from modern communications technologies. But this idea is one that has sometimes been called informationism, right? Informationism is the faith in the collection and dissemination of information as the way towards social progress and personal happiness. So again, it's not a new claim. It goes back to this story of the Enlightenment. I don't know if you've ever been to a Walt Disney in America, but Walt Disney, the creator of Walt Disney, was actually a very, very optimistic person who loved progress. In fact, before he died, he was working on the design of a progress city. And in the opening panorama at the Epcot Center, which is one of the Disney theme parks, there is this picture of a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, right? It almost looks like that painting I showed you earlier, moving from darkness to light. And there's this eternal city that sort of appears on a hill. These are actually biblical images. But what's happened is we replaced technology as the savior. Michael Smith is a historian, and he wrote that Epcot is more than Tomorrowland on steroids. It functions as a missionary outpost dispensing a catechism. And that catechism is that technology will usher in a sort of a utopia, a bright, big, beautiful tomorrow. Maybe some of you have ridden on the Carousel of Progress, which sort of shows these vignettes of an American family moving towards a utopian sort of ideal. And in many places you can read about the Church of Techno-Optimism, right? The New York Times had an article on this. The true ideology of Silicon Valley is an unwavering belief in the power of technology to basically solve all things. Neil Postman is a writer from America who wrote many decades ago about media and media ecology, and he writes the following: people believe technology works. They rely on it. It makes promises. They are bereft when denied access to it, that they're delighted when they're in its presence, that for most people it works in mysterious ways. They condemn people who speak against it. They stand in awe of it, and that in a born-again mode, they alter their lifestyles, their schedules, their habits, and their relationships to accommodate it. If this be not a form of religious belief, what is? So he's pointing to this trust in technology as a kind of substitute religious belief. Now I know some of you will know who this is, Marc Andreessen. Do you know Marc Andreessen? He was the creator of the first graphical World Wide Web browser called Mosaic. And Marc Andreessen is now a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley and a clever technologist. And he recently wrote an article with the bold headline, AI will save the world, is what he's promoting. And basically he says, once we have, these sort of perfected large language models, every child will have a personal tutor. Every person will have a personal coach. Personal productivity will accelerate rapidly. The creative arts will flower. And he goes on to say, in a way that's familiar to some of the other quotes I gave you, he said that these will reduce death, reduce war, and make bloodshed unnecessary. I mean, these are kind of biblical claims, actually. Right? It's kind of like a dream of a heaven that's ushered in by human technology, but one that does not include God. So you can find this on his blog, AI Will Save the World. And this is a kind of technological imperative, is what it's been called before. The technological imperative says that new technologies are inevitable and essential, and that they must be developed and accepted for the good of society, without thinking about the consequences, because of course they're going to bring about progress. Oppenheimer, maybe you saw the Oppenheimer movie last summer. This was not part of the movie, but at one point Oppenheimer, who created the atomic bomb, said, when you see something that's technically sweet, you go ahead and you do it, and then you argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. That is the way it was with the atomic bomb. That's kind of the attitude at places like it seems to be at OpenAI, where they just sort of do things without really thinking about the implications. It's a kind of technological imperative. And all of this is a kind of technicism. This is a word for the trust in progress, trust in technology to solve all of our problems and to bring health and material prosperity. This book, Infinite Progress, I grabbed this graphic from the web, has the subtitle, How the Internet and Technology Will End Ignorance, Disease, Poverty, Hunger, and War. It's a kind of religious belief. It's a substitute religious belief is what it is. And this is the reigning ideology in Silicon Valley. Neil Postman again writes, "We believe nothing, if not that history is moving us towards some preordained paradise, and that technology is the force behind that movement." Of course, this story is not new. The Bible has a story about a failed technology project called the Tower of Babel, in which people built this tower to bridge heaven and earth. And of course, they wanted to build their own bridge between heaven and earth by human wits and by human technology. And they did it to make a name for themselves. And in Christian lingo, this is called idolatry. Whenever you replace your trust in God with something in creation, it can become an idol. And there's even people working on transhumanism. Maybe you've heard of transhumanism, but it's this effort to use technology to equip humans so that they can move beyond sort of limitations of human beings. Transhumanists hope that you can use science and technology to become post-human, that we can move beyond our sort of created limits and have greatly more improved capacities than human beings currently have. And some people, including Ray Kurzweil, believe that technology will ultimately solve the problem of death. Have you heard of Ray Kurzweil? He's a very smart fellow, was also at the MIT lab, but is currently director of engineering at Google, inventor, very clever guy. But he believes that one day that he'll be able to download his brain into a computer and that he will be able to live forever in a virtual paradise. Here's a quote from his book, The Singularity is Near. He writes, "Actually, there won't be mortality by the end of the 21st century. Not if you take advantage of the 21st century's brain porting technology. We will be software, not hardware." So here again, you see the religious belief in a heaven replaced with a religious belief in a virtual heaven that will be set up inside of some supercomputer somewhere. And I think that if you download your brain into a computer, you basically become a computer. I think that a Christian worldview would push back against this and say that we're more than just the stuff in our brains, we're more than just the electrochemical reactions in our brains, but we are beings with a spirit and a body that are tied together, and that all attempts to do this is going to be a fool's errand. But anyways, it demonstrates how far this faith goes. Now, there are critics to technological progress, to be sure. Not everyone is a technological optimist. And here's two examples of some classic writers in this field. You know, Jacques Ellul was a famous philosopher, French philosopher, who wrote a book called The Technological Society. And he claimed that, we need to be careful, that we can see technology as a God who saves. You can call everything into question in society, including God, but you can't do that with technology. And we need to be aware that technology is not going to deliver what it promises in the end. That a world that's driven only by efficiency is not going to be the kind of world that we want to live in. That technological means, when they become technological ends, can reduce us as humans. Neil Postman, one of his famous books is called Technopoly, believes that we need to be careful about allowing technology to take complete control of every aspect of our life, something he calls technopoly. And what we need to be is loving resistance fighters, is what he says. And I think he makes a lot of good points about how the technological imperative actually does not lead to a utopia like many people who believe in the Enlightenment would say. And of course, more recently, there have been people who have been writing about how actually progress might be sending us in the opposite direction. There's something called a progress trap that people have been writing about. that the progress trap theory says that progress proceeds, but eventually reaches a certain scale where there are traps, right? Developments that seem to provide benefits in the short term, but over the longer term ultimately lead to unsustainability and disaster. And we can see global biodiversity is decreasing, climate change is increasing, and there are lots of pessimistic views about the future, despite the promises of technological change. The Gaia hypothesis, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Gaia hypothesis, but it basically says at some point the world, the Earth, will shake off human beings because we're like a parasite on the planet, and eventually the Earth will get rid of us in order to allow the Earth to flourish. There's the Vulnerable World Hypothesis from the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, where they hypothesize at some point we will develop a dangerous technology that people can just build in their basement, and when it's unleashed will basically destroy the world and will destroy all of life. So these are very pessimistic views, the idea that we progress until we hit some kind of limit in nature, and then we end up being set back. And of course the artists and the filmmakers have also warned against this kind of thing, right? If you've watched any science fiction, they're mostly pessimistic views of the future, right? They're kind of the Frankenstein narrative, where humankind builds a technology and eventually that technology turns on us and destroys us. That is the theme of most science fiction films. Have you ever watched Terminator? Yeah, right, that's the theme, right? Human beings build Skynet, and then Skynet turns on human beings and tries to destroy humanity. And we see similar themes in films like Blade Runner and Battlestar Galactica and Black Mirror, right? They basically ask the question, what does it mean to be human? And what happens when we make poor choices? A science fiction writer once wrote that a good science fiction story should be able to predict not the automobile, but the traffic jam. Right? Not just predict what a new technology will be, but the problems that will come from that. Maybe you've seen WALL-E, the Disney movie WALL-E. I like WALL-E because it's a science fiction film that is pessimistic. You know, human beings sitting in easy boy chairs, slurping drinks and watching screens all the time. But in the end, they return to Earth with a fledgling little plant to sort of do what humans were originally called to do. So I think there's things to be learned from science fiction. So these are two stories, two very different stories. The Enlightenment story is an optimistic story, right? The quest for a fantastic future, and a kind of human ushered in paradise brought about by technology. And then there's the postmodern story, which is another story in which we create technology and we reach a point where it turns on us, or there's a progress trap, and we get destroyed. If you want interesting reading, here's a book by Daniel Wilson, who's a PhD in robotics from Carnegie Mellon in the States. He wrote a book called How to Survive a Robot Uprising. Okay? And he gives you advice of what to do when the robots revolt, right? Technical advice about how to secure yourself. So it's a bit of a joke, but it plays on this idea, right, that technology is going to come after us and destroys us. So what are we to do with this? I like the words of the American philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre. Alasdair MacIntyre once wrote, "We cannot answer the question, what ought I to do, unless we first answer the prior question of what story am I a part?" Right? And as engineers and computer scientists, we don't always ask the question about what story are we living into, what story is framing our work, what story is animating what we do. There always is a story behind everything that we do. And a story answers the questions, what does it mean to be human? A lot of science fiction authors work with that theme, right? Like, what is the nature of the universe? Stories answer these questions, What's wrong with the world, right? And what's the remedy? A story helps answer these questions. And the Enlightenment story has one answer, and the postmodern story has another answer to these questions. But I'd like to suggest that the ancient story, the biblical story, provides, I think, a better story, in my opinion, right? So the Bible was written in the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, but I think that they can actually offer us advice for the digital age and the age of AI. The biblical story, just quickly, spans the biblical themes. If you read the narrative of Scripture, it talks about creation, fall, redemption, new creation, and that story, that biblical story, answers the questions. What's wrong? What's the nature of the universe? Who are we? The creation story tells us that God created an earth that was good, that human beings were made in His image, so they're different than machines, and that human beings were given responsibility to look after the earth, not only just look after it, but to uncover and unfold all of its possibilities, but to do so in a responsible way. The biblical story then talks about the fall, when human beings rebel against God, and what the consequences of that were. What it meant is that all of creation was kind of groaning, that there were implications for our work, for our studies, and for technology, and for our family life and our relationships. It was comprehensive. This rebellion caused huge consequences in the world. And then, in the sort of middle of the story, we see the coming of Jesus, who is sort of at the center of the biblical story. And Jesus' death and resurrection brings about something called reconciliation. He's restoring things to the way that God intended them to be in the original creation. And that He calls Christians, He calls humans, to participate in restoring things in the way that they ought to be. And of course, that will be accomplished in its entirety when Jesus comes back. But in the meantime, we're called to make some imperfect models of a perfect world to come. And then finally, new creation. The Bible begins with humankind living in a garden, but at the end of the Bible, we see a city. So we move from a garden to a city. And a city sort of has the implication of cultural development and technology. And I think the sort of Enlightenment story basically is parasitic to the biblical story. Right? They've replaced this view of a new city with this new city that we will build, not one that God will build. In the Bible, the new city is one whose builder and architect is God. But the Enlightenment story took that same storyline but subverted it. And I'd like to, unpack this story a little bit more. I think there are always a worldview behind everything that we do. There's the Frankenstein narrative, the postmodern story, which says that technology will destroy us. There's the, Enlightenment narrative that says AI will save the world, technology will save the world. But the Bible, in contrast, the biblical story, the Bible is unique in its uncompromising rejection of all attempts to identify one part of the world or of creation as either the villain or the savior. There's nothing in the world that is the villain, and there's nothing in the world that's the savior. The problem with the world, according to the biblical story, is sin. And the remedy is Jesus and redemption. And so it's a very different story than the Enlightenment story and the postmodern story. And my argument will be that will actually lead to a more responsible approach to technology. And I'll get to that in a moment. The biblical story talks about creation and about created structure. And then it talks about how humans are given the responsibility to unfold that good creation and to direct it in ways that are obedient to God, and to care for the earth and to show love for our neighbors. And so the creational possibilities either get directed towards disobedience due to sin, or they get redirected towards more redeeming applications. And so the biblical call is to develop responsible technology in ways that show love to our neighbor and to care for the earth and its creatures. But it begins with a recognition of the goodness of creation, but then to see how is it being directed. Is it being directed towards obedient ways or disobedient ways? And Christian thinking and Christian philosophy and Christian worldview thinking actually discerns certain norms for the world. Okay, and norms are essentially the way that things ought to be. There is a sort of oughtness to creation. And so some of these norms include
justice norms, right? The Bible calls us to exercise justice. And the designs that we create need to promote justice and give each thing their due. There's a stewardship norm. The stewardship norm says that we need to, work towards sustainability. We need to care for the earth and the environment. There's a caring norm. The caring norm says we need to show love and care for our neighbors and show due care. There's social norms. Social norms say that we have to build tools that help people to relate well and that don't create divisions and disharmony. There's a transparency norm in creation, that we need to make things that are clear and understandable, also in computing. That we have to make sure that we don't bear false witness, that we tell the truth. There's a norm of delightful harmony, which has to do with combining form and function, creating tools that are pleasing to use, a concern for user experience, UX design, and human-computer interfaces, these sorts of things. And then there's a trust norm, building tools that are reliable, that don't hallucinate, that are dependable, and also that we don't put our trust in technology. Here's a quote, if you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. And these are kind of things that God has tuned in the creation. And I think whether you're a Christian or not, you can see that the world kind of works in this way. That if we ignore justice, there's going to be consequences. If we ignore sort of the environment, there's going to be problems down the road. That if we ignore sort of caring, there's going to be issues as well. All of these things, if we ignore them, come back with consequences. And Christians believe that that's because God has made the world in a certain way. And you'll see some overlap between these norms and things like IEEE, ethically aligned design, value-sensitive design. If you look sort of in the engineering and computer science communities, people are talking about how to integrate ethics into everything, right? The problem in a computer science education is that if you take 40 courses in computer science and then you slap one ethics course on the end, that doesn't make you an ethical person, I don't think. I think we need to live into these kinds of things. We need to see that the world is tuned a certain way. We need to make sure that we don't just develop tunnel vision and just look at bits and bytes. We need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture, or else there's going to be consequences. So here's another quote about norms, that they're things where we need to be resourceful and responsible and use our imaginations for thinking about good ways to apply these norms to our designs. So there's always some kind of worldview story. I'm claiming that no matter what, even for people who are atheistic and do not believe in God, there's always a story. Here's a quote from Simone Weil. One has only the choice between God and an idol. There are no other possibilities. If one denies God, one is worshiping some things of this world in the belief that one sees them only as such, but in fact, though unknown to oneself, imagining the attributes of divinity in them. Okay? And I think that's true. Here's actually a quote from the communications of the ACM, so the flagship magazine of the ACM, from the April 21 issue, the 2021 issue. And here's a quote from one of the articles, flagship articles in that magazine. It says, "Researchers and practitioners ought to be intentional and explicit about worldviews and value assumptions. The systems they design will always encode some belief about the world." And my claim, my proposition, which I just asked you to think about, is that the biblical story, the biblical worldview, leads to more responsible technology, as opposed to an Enlightenment story which just talks about forging ahead because technology will always bring a better, brighter future. Just a real quick diversion here. There was a philosopher and sociologist named Charles Taylor. He's a famous person in philosophy. And he's looked at our modern secular society, trying to understand how we got here. And he's written that our secular society only recognizes the natural world. It only believes in material things. But people are actually still, he says, haunted by the possibility of some kind of transcendence. When we look at art, when we face death, we have this feeling that there must be something more than just the stuff of the world. And in fact, in some ways, people turn to technology for that feeling of transcendence. They look to technology as the savior to fix the human condition instead of God. His famous book is called A Secular Age, where he thinks about these things. In one place he wrote, "The biblical cosmology was replaced by the march of science. Our whole background understanding and view of the world has been transformed." And his claim is that this modern Enlightenment story, the story of technological progress, subverts what was originally the biblical story and replaces the savior and the remedy for the situation. And I think that's true. So what are the implications of a biblical worldview? Well, if you read the Bible, it tells us that technology will not be our savior, although it can be helpful, and technology will not be the ultimate problem, even though it may cause problems. It's not the ultimate villain. We can't believe in a utopia or dystopia caused by technology. And the biblical story tells us to put technology in service of God, neighbor, and creation. We have to make sure that technological means, do not become ends in themselves. We have to be attentive to these creational norms of justice, right, and social norms, and sustainability, and other things. And that we have to exercise freedom and responsibility. Freedom versus this technological imperative. Responsibility versus this push to move quickly and break things. Here's a definition of technology that sort of comes out of the biblical understanding of technology. So technology is not just gadgets, it's not just devices, it's actually more than that. Technology is a distinct human cultural activity. Technology is what we make of the world. It's cultural, in which human beings exercise freedom. So there is no technological determinism. We really do have freedom. But we also have responsibility. We exercise freedom and responsibility. In America, you may know on the East Coast, there is a Statue of Liberty, which is all about freedom. But some people have suggested that what America needs is another statue on the West Coast, a statue of responsibility. Okay? And Americans love to talk about their freedom. But freedom always comes with responsibility. They're never unlinked. They're never unhooked. So we need freedom and responsibility with technology. And in the biblical story, we see that as a response to God by forming and transforming the natural creation with the aid of tools and procedures for practical ends and purposes. That's a definition of technology that's shaped by the biblical story. So responsible technology then begins by understanding that technology is value-laden, right? It has justice implications. It has sustainability implications. It isn't just bits and bytes. We're called to exercise both freedom and responsibility. Those two things always go together. And that actually, as you become more and more trained in technology, as you get PhDs and master's degrees and you go off into industry, you actually have more responsibility because you know more and you have more power and influence. We need to think about holistic design and reflecting norms like justice and stewardship and aesthetic and cultural, social, caring, transparency, these norms that I talked about. In fact, in the college the university where I teach, when we teach the Agile software development method, we not only think about user stories and about things that we need to technically accomplish, we ask these questions too as we're sort of moving forward. Is this going to cause any injustice? Is there any sustainability or environmental stewardship issues here? How does this help people to grow closer together? Is this showing care to our customer and to our end user and to others? I mean, those are questions you don't often talk about when you're doing software engineering, but when you ignore them, there's always consequences for your company or for yourself or for your customer. We need to build technology that serves people, not people serving technology or technique. And another virtue that I think falls out of distinctly Christian thinking is humility. Okay, if you look at the virtues that the Greek philosophers talked about, they never talked about humility. Humility is a distinctly Christian value, and I think it makes you a better engineer and computer scientist. because you think about the ways in which you might not know everything, and you think about how you need to be humble in your work and in your approach to technology. I think it's a good posture. And then as Christians and other people of all kinds of other beliefs, of course, because we live in a world that's pluralistic, we need to work towards the common good together, right? So this idea in Christian thought of principled pluralism, in which we encourage respectful dialogue in the public sphere among those of differing beliefs to forge partnership to service the common good. So when you go to work at Samsung or you work at other places, you will encounter people of all kinds of different beliefs. And if you're a Christian or otherwise, the call here is to partner together with people, and even if they come at things from different beliefs, to try and be an influencer towards moving things towards the common good. And there's organization like the IEEE, the Institute for Ethical AI and Machine Learning, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, right? The Technical Committee on Roboethics, Americans for Responsible Technology. There's the Partnership on AI to benefit people, AI for good. These are all organizations where you can join to push technology in a more responsible direction. And I think Christians have an even more compelling reason to do this. Here's a quote from Brad Smith, president of Microsoft. He says, "Ultimately, a global conversation about ethical principles for AI will require a bigger tent. There will be a need for seats at the table, not only for technologists and governments, NGOs, and educators, but for philosophers and representatives of the world's many religions." I'm a member of AI in Faith, and that is actually an interfaith group. So there's Muslims, there's Jews, there's Buddhists, and there's Christians, and we're talking together about how we can work towards the common good. And I think in my own life, the biblical story pushes me to work towards the common good. My faith actually animates what I do. And then finally, I want to quote Fred Brooks. Do any of you know who Fred Brooks is? Frederick Brooks is a recipient of the ACM Turing Award in the 1990s, which is the Nobel Prize in Computer Science. He is perhaps one of the most famous computer scientists in America, next to Donald Knuth. And I've met him a couple times. He's also a Bible-believing Christian. He actually helped develop the IBM System 360 in the 60s, and he wrote a famous book called The Mythical Man Month. And if you actually read that, he talks about his faith. It's a famous software engineering book, The Mythical Man Month. But he once wrote in his ACM Turing Award speech, he wrote, "If we would have our creations be true, beautiful, and good, we have to attend to our hearts." Because it's that story, it's the loves that we forge in our hearts that motivate what we do in the world. And so we need to attend to our hearts. Well, what is it that's animating our lives? And of course, from the Bible, there's a similar call. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Right? From a Christian perspective, your heart is of strategic importance because everything you do flows from your heart. And Fred Brooks would say, even our AI and our technology and our computer science actually come from the human heart. And so that's my call for you today, is to think about where is your heart pointed. And in my own life, it's been animated by the biblical story and by the Christian story, and it's made all the difference for me in my career. So, thank you very much.
Thank Dr. Derek for your wonderful talk. Let's have a question and answering time from audience.
Thanks for the great talk. It was really fun and it's thought-provoking, I think. And like, if I take the biblical view,
Yeah.
and
Jerry, why don't you use the mic then?
Much better.
so if I take the biblical view and think about the global viewpoint, like global aspects, and try to draw some behavior patterns or like strategies for your living patterns or action patterns, then I think it's kind of the mixture of the first two views. Firstly, like you have some optimistic views, so that like, you still develop the technologies, but at the same time, like you take some of the pessimistic viewpoints, so that like you are also like trying to build some techniques to prevent the technologies to be used in a vicious ways. But I think like then the core question that I also have is then what is so different? And at the end, it's just a mixture of them. And as a scientist or engineer, what should I do? Like if I just take the behavior pattern of both group of people, like, would it really change something? Is it really okay that like you make some advances in AI or like making fake videos, knowing that it will be used by some people? Like I mean, like the original intention was not for it to be used in vicious ways, but you know that there are some people, because at the core of this problem, there are people using this, creating like very creative people making like vicious ways of using technology. You know that those people exist. So like the question that I often have is like, is it really okay to be involved in like creating, advancing the technologies, knowing that there are like those people? And is it really enough just to be involved in the other part, trying to make a safe technology, but knowing that it's not enough? So that's the questions that always that I usually always have. So like, yeah, so it's really fun, but I don't know like if I got the answer for those questions. So that's what I wanted to ask.
Well, that's a really thoughtful question, and that's sort of at the heart of this a little bit too, right? I think that from a Christian standpoint, from the biblical story, we would say that the goodness of creation, the possibilities like AI that are part of sort of the natural world, are always intertwined with sin. And so we're always going to see, we're never going to completely escape that. But what we need to think about is, well, first and foremost, individual responsibility. So what are you doing? How are you using your gifts and your skills? Are you moving, that's that structure direction question. Are you moving in ways that are more obedient, that are more helpful? Or are you using your skills to kind of advance more vicious or malicious sort of means? But I think we can also work more corporately, right? But what are you doing in your company, or what are you doing in your associations with other people? And what can we do with the government also to kind of talk about AI regulations? Can we help advance safeguards, right? The EU has done this. I don't know what the state of Korean legislation is. The US is always slow with regulation. But we regulate drugs, we regulate automobiles, we regulate airplanes. I think AI is another area where we're going to need, because those people are always going to be there, using AI for malicious or vicious sort of ways, to have some kind of advocacy for regulation. And then working with those organizations I showed, like IEEE, Ethically Aligned Design, ACM's Code of Ethics, AI for Good. These sorts of things are areas where we can work together, right? I mean, if you think about all the good things you can do with AI, AI for monitoring climate, green AI technologies, AI to reduce traffic fatalities, AI for drug discovery, AI to help with medical imaging. There's so many wonderful ways that AI can actually bring about what in the Christian story we would call shalom, moving towards the way things should be, peace and so on. But of course, the Christian story also tells us that technology is not the savior. So even if you come up with really powerful and wonderful technologies, they will not bring world peace.
It will not end war, because that's a problem of the human heart. It's not a problem of not enough technology. And I think that's the shortcoming of the Enlightenment story, is that technology is good and it can move us towards more care and more love, but it will never ultimately solve the problem, because the problem is the human heart. It's not a lack of technology or understanding. So I hope that helps answer a little bit. Yeah.
So, thank you for the beautiful lecture. My question is pretty similar to the previous one. So, I really like your examples of Oppenheimer
Yeah.
and OpenAI. And some people just are so focused on advancing technology that they can't really think or predict how that technology is going to be used in the future. So as students here and researchers who's busy catching up new technologies and developing new technologies, what kind of advice do you have?
Yeah, I think the reason why, that Oppenheimer story or quotation rings true is that if you believe that the solution to our problems is more advanced technology, then you will always be just pushing and pushing without thinking about the consequences, because you believe technology in itself is a good, right? And that will not lead you towards responsible technology. It will cause you towards reckless innovation. It's the move quickly and break things kind of approach. And so what I point to is these norms again, making sure that as you develop and unfold technology, you're thinking about justice, you're thinking about sustainability, you're thinking about transparency. And that's something, and all the other norms that I mentioned, and that's something that you don't only do individually, but you need to, also within community discern that. And I think computer scientists can't decide that alone. Heaven help us if only computer scientists are determining how we ought to unfold technology. I'm a computer scientist, so I say that knowing, right? We need philosophers. We need social scientists who can help us understand what are the consequences. People like Sherry Turkle at MIT, she's written these books like Alone Together, Reclaiming Conversation, like looking at the effects of these technologies on our persons. So I think that these norms sort of point a way. They don't provide an exact prescription, but they provide a way of thinking about the world that's bigger than just bits and bytes. The challenge of a computer scientist is that sometimes you're so in the weeds that you just you can't zoom out and look at the bigger implications of what you are doing. And so to kind of change your consciousness. And of course, if you're working out of the Christian story, the biblical story, you realize you have a responsibility to God. This is not just something that's a choice you make. It's something you're obliged to do because of the story in which you're a part. And so, that's a helpful way forward. And these organizations like the IEEE and others are thinking about ethics. It's just we need more voices. We need more pressure, we need more regulation, we need things to help constrain the sort of reckless innovation that others might be trying to push. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is, if you just said, if we just believe in the Enlightenment story, then we are just pushing the advancement of the technology. I agree with that. But with the pessimistic view, because of the concerns, they try to kind of prevent advancing technologies. I think if you just add those two, then there will be some people trying to advance,
Yes.
and some other people preventing the advancements. That's the global view, I think, as the sum of those two people, global people. Then if we have like a set of like those people believing in the biblical story, then they will also try to balance between those two patterns, I think. Then I fully agree that like individual perspectives, like in each individuals, they are different. Like they have like different motivations. They are different. As you said, like they would have different norms. But as a global view, what do you think is the difference between these two situations? Like one, like with as the sum of those two groups, and the other, like the group of biblical people. I think at the global viewpoints, it seems they are the same, but are there some differences that you can imagine?
Yeah, a good question. And here I have a slide that an extra slide that I can quickly pop up, which sort of shows some of the good. I mean, you know this. You're working in AI, but I think the problem with the pessimists is that they always think of the Frankenstein narrative, that no matter what we do, the technology is going to come after us and destroy us and eat us. There actually are some people who believe that's a good thing. They sort of see the sort of development of technology along the lines of evolution. So in the past, survival of the fittest, certain species disappeared, and they believe, well, in the future, if robots become the fittest species and we get displaced, that's just revolution. They actually don't mind if human beings get lost and so on. But the problem with the pessimistic view is that there's so many things we ought to do, right? The big question is, just because we can do something, does that mean we ought to do something, right? And so I think the pessimists sort of lose the picture of what the Christians would see as the goodness of creation, the good possibilities. But those good possibilities are always intertwined with sin, which is why we need to be on guard against those sorts of things. So the other thing that a Christian, I think, is attentive to is Christian character and virtue. So I talked about humility, but Christians also believe in how God shapes us as persons, so that we want what God wants, so that we become the kinds of people that are attentive to norms and attentive to what is an obedient response. And so it's not just a set of ideas in your head. We're actually not just a brain on a stick. We are human beings that have a heart, and that's why I ended with that. How do you point your heart into a direction that wants to unfold technology responsibly? And I think a story like the biblical story gives us a context for why we would want to become those kinds of people. Again, if you take 40 courses in computer science as an undergrad, and then you add one ethics course to the end, that doesn't make you into the kind of person who wants to do the right thing. That's not enough. We need more than that. So I think the biblical story not only provides a rationalization for avoiding, or a story that helps you avoid the excesses of the Enlightenment story and the pessimism of the postmodern story, but it also equips you with meaning. That's the other thing. You have meaning for what you're doing. It isn't just about you. You are living within this bigger story, which gives meaning and purpose to everything that you do, and also shapes you and equips you for doing that. That doesn't mean things are going to be easy, or that you're always going to know what the right thing is, but you have a framework for your life. That's more than just about getting rich and getting powerful and getting market share and whatever else, because those things in the end really won't make you happy. They won't provide a meaning that will give your life a context and a hope and meaning in the end. And I think the biblical story is more than just an ethics framework. It's a meaning for your life, which I think is even more important. By the way, once I was at an ACM conference in America, and you all know the ACM, right? Association of Computing Machinery. And I talked with one of the people who wrote the ACM Code of Ethics. He was on the board that built the ACM Code of Ethics. And I said, where did this come from, this Code of Ethics? Right? I mean, the ACM is not a Christian organization, but these ethics, must have come from somewhere.
and he kind of whispered to me, he says, we don't say this out loud, but he says, they're based on Judeo-Christian values, really. But we can't say that. But really, a lot of these ethics have something behind it. And we're sort of living in that sort of Christian tradition in the West, especially. But the problem is we're becoming more and more secular, and we're buying into the Enlightenment story. And if we push that to its extreme, we're going to have environmental problems. We're going to have justice problems in terms of the haves and the have-nots, and there's going to be all kinds of issues if we're just thinking about the Enlightenment story. So, a few more thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your insight.
Yeah.
And I strongly agree with your opinion that the AI companies should take more responsibility in their development. But I see this huge controversy over the big AI tech companies collecting web data illegally. And I see what they're trying to do is to take the initiative. They collect as much as data as possible when there's no regulation or restrictions, so that they take the initiative, they develop a larger, stronger model. And I think that's a very unfair situation where the responsible developers will fall behind that. And because responsibility, it takes more process to collect data, for example, and that will slow down the development. And I want to ask your opinion on this.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, you have the irresponsible companies that are just vacuuming up data from the web, ignoring the robots.txt file, and just going ahead and grabbing things. That's a justice issue that goes against the justice norm, right? For intellectual property and copyright. And many of those companies are now being sued, right? The New York Times is suing OpenAI, and so there's. So, first of all, if you ignore those kinds of things, you will be dealing with regulations and lawsuits and other things. You will be encumbered by that. But yes, you will also have more data. And I think, again, going back to the Christian story, another thing about the biblical story, which I think is helpful, is that in that story, we're not called to be successful at any cost from a business standpoint. We're called to be faithful. And so I think in some cases, in some ways, that may put people who have those kinds of values at a innovative disadvantage. But I think in the long term, if you sort of follow these norms, you have a possibility to flourish because you're finding the right way, But yeah, the Christian story calls us to not be driven primarily by success, but to be driven by being faithful to these norms. And I think that's a Christian calling. And I think there are also people of other faiths who have these ethics. I mean, even the ACM Code of Ethics says you have to respect the intellectual property. So even these secular ethical frameworks are being ignored by some of these companies. And my call to you is the way that we move towards more responsible technologies, that begins with you and me. And then doing our best with what we can within the power and the frameworks that we have. So that's my call.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, you want to come down?
Yeah, so I was interested in kind of idea that Silicon Valley and Agile and Scrum kind of have the idea of fail fast, fail quickly.
Yeah.
And looking at it from the sense of when you said you have to zoom out, look at the problem from a bigger stance, is that potentially slowing down entrepreneurship in the sense that it's taking those companies and making them have to spend longer time thinking about the potential ethical implications of their company before they even develop? Just kind of what are your thoughts on?
Yeah. Yeah, so the sort of move quickly and break things, I don't know how else I could rephrase that, but moving responsibly and making better things, I think is a more responsible approach. Yeah, this sort of
drive to innovate without thinking about consequences, I think is may in the short term seem to be a more strategic approach, but I think in the long term it's always going to lead to consequences, right? If you ignore justice and if you ignore the environment, and I think part of the problem in business is that we're thinking about the next quarter. We're not thinking about 100 years from now or whatever it is, and zooming out and looking at the bigger picture. And there are these labels in the United States. When you go to the grocery store, you can buy milk that's organic, right? And you can buy household cleaning products that have the good housekeeping seal of approval. I think one way to distinguish a new company from other companies is to somehow have, maybe it's a little badge that some organization puts on saying this is ethically designed, right? You buy makeup, like no animals have been, they test makeup on animals apparently. But what if we could design something, actually use that as part of our market as well? Like, this product, I don't know what the wording would be, but has been designed according to ethical, this product has been attentive to norms. This product has got a seal of approval. And I think it could be actually a strategic advantage, to kind of market yourself as a more ethical alternative to other companies that are just, ignoring those sorts of things. But yeah, adding that extra consideration will add extra CPU cycles and thinking. But I think in the long run, we'll produce a better product that'll create a better people, and help bring shalom nearer. So yeah, adding that into the agile software development cycle, we actually teach that to our students too. Like, ethics can't be an afterthought. Ethics needs to be kind of baked into what we're doing. And because you're working in large language models and AI, some of the things you're building will have huge impacts on people. I don't know whether, I'll just show you one more slide really quickly, but I hope you've all seen this as people working in AI. Have you read the book Weapons of Math Destruction? Has anyone seen that book before? Yeah, Kathy O'Neill. I think this is required reading for all data scientists. The book's a little dated now, but the ideas are there, right? The subtitle is How Big Data Increases Inequality, Threatens Democracy. Right? Automating inequality is all about how AI and machine learning can actually advance inequality. Machine bias, here's a whole article about how a software system, machine learning system that determines who gets parole from prison is actually biased against African Americans. Right? Amazon scrapped its recruiting system because it was biased against women. And these things are prevalent everywhere, right? Whenever you've got a data set, again, everyone works from a particular story and nothing is neutral. Even data sets are not neutral. Even algorithms are not neutral because they value one thing over another thing. There's always a worldview at play. So you have a huge responsibility for justice as well. This is a fundamental norm in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And there will be all kinds of consequences if you ignore these sorts of things. So, I don't know, I can leave it at that, or I'll hand it back to Professor.
Yeah, thank you. Last time, and no more question. Yeah, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Derek Sherman, and I'm very also pleased to encourage you to think about more responsible technology as a AI researcher and developers. And he also challenged you to think about more for why we do something and how we do, and try to our effort for caring other people and loving other people rather than just making money and for just getting a good job. Yeah, that would be most challenging stuff to you. Yeah, let's give him big hands again.